A 15-year-old boy puts his hand into a box. The old woman holding the poison needle at his neck tells him the box will cause unbearable pain. If he withdraws his hand, she will kill him. If he keeps it in, he proves he is human. The implication hangs unspoken. Most of the people who take this test are not. What makes the scene stranger is the boy's mother. She is a woman trained to face down political enemies without flinching, but when this old woman tells her to leave the room, she obeys. She walks out and closes the door, and her son is alone with the needle, the box, and a question the novel keeps returning to. What does it mean to remain human when every force around you, political, chemical, evolutionary, is pushing you towards something else? Away. The boy passes the test. He keeps his hand in the box through pain that should have broken him. And the old woman's response is not relief, not celebration. She says, "You may be the one." Not "you are, maybe." Then she weeps. That gap between passing the test and what the test giver knows that the boy does not is the engine of Dune. Frank Herbert's novel has sold millions of copies and won both the Hugo and Nebula Awards, but the reason it still grips readers decades later is not its influence or its scale. Every abstract idea in the book, the spice economy, the 90-generation breeding program, the desert ecology, is anchored in the same concrete pressure that opens the first chapter. A body in a room, a threat, and a choice that cannot be unmade. If you find that scene gripping, the rest of the book delivers on what it implies. Episode 1: The Reverend Mother's Arrival to Duke Leto's Arrival and Strategic Planning on Arrakis. On the night the Reverend Mother came to Castle Caladan, Paul Atreides was already dreaming of Arrakis. He dreamed of a cavern with water dripping from the ceiling, a sound he had never heard, and of a girl with blue eyes who called him by a name he did not yet know. And then his mother's voice, somewhere above the dream, said his name and pulled him out of the dripping dark. His mother, the Lady Jastica, came to his room with someone beside her. Paul saw the old woman first as a bulk in the doorway, a shadow that did not belong in the familiar architecture of his childhood. The suspensor lamp, dimmed low and floating near the floor, cast its half-light across her features. Hair like matted spider webs, a hood drawn close, and eyes that glittered with the calculation of someone who had long stopped being surprised by anything. "Is he not small for his age, Jessica?" the old woman asked. Paul heard his mother's voice answer, tight and controlled. "The Atreides are known to start late getting their growth, Your Reverence." The title landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "Your Reverence." This was a Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother, an imperial truth-sayer, and she was standing in his bedroom on a warm night 1 week before the family was scheduled to depart for Arrakis. The old woman made a sound, something between a laugh and a dismissal. "You know, I've never quite trusted your explanation for his size. Now, leave us. I will speak with the boy alone." Paul watched his mother. She did something he had never seen her do before. She obeyed without question. She turned and walked out, closing the door behind her. And in that motion, Paul understood she was afraid, truly afraid of this ancient figure who now turned her full attention on him. "Come here, boy." Paul found his legs moving before his mind caught up. He stopped where she gestured, standing beside her knees, and watched her lift a green metal cube from the folds of her gown. The cube was perhaps 15 centimeters on a side, unremarkable except for one detail, a round hole in one face, dark and perfectly circular, large enough for a hand. "Put your right hand in the box," she said. Paul looked at the hole. "What's in the box?" "Pain." The word sat between them, flat and factual. From her gown she produced another object, a thin metal tube, silver, with a needle at one end. She held it where the light could catch the point. "This is the Gom Jabbar," she said, "the high-handed enemy. It's a poison needle. If you remove your hand from the box before I tell you, the needle will touch your neck, and you will die." Paul stared at the needle. "Why would I remove my hand?" "Because the box will cause you pain. I will increase the pain until you cannot bear it. An animal would remove its hand. A human would keep its hand in the box. A test of humanity." Paul felt his pulse in his throat and understood, with a clarity that would become familiar to him in later years, that this was not about courage. This was about something older, something buried in the nerves. He put his hand in the box. At first there was nothing, a faint tingling like holding a limb too long in one position. Then the tingling sharpened, and Paul bit the inside of his cheek. The old woman watched his face with her glittering eyes, saying nothing. The pain climbed. Paul felt his hand begin to burn. Not heat, this was deeper, a nerve induction that bypassed skin and muscle and spoke directly to the raw sensorium of the body. His fingers wanted to curl, he kept them straight. "Do you withdraw?" the old woman asked. "No." The pain became a fire that had no flame. Paul could feel his flesh screaming at him to pull away, to end this, to do the thing any creature with a survival instinct would do. He bit down on his palm, hard, and tasted blood. 4 bloody crescents appeared where his teeth met skin. He did not withdraw. Time became a thing measured only in the slow, deliberate advance of agony. Paul held himself in the box, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that was not a voice whispered the litany against fear. The Bene Gesserit mantra his mother had taught him since he could speak. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. He did not withdraw, and then the pain stopped. Kol Wahad, the old woman breathed. The words were ancient, a language Paul did not know, but the tone was unmistakable. Astonishment. No woman-child ever withstood that much. Paul pulled his hand from the box and looked at it. The flesh was unmarked. No burn, no blister, no wound except the 4 bloody crescents where his own teeth had broken skin. The old woman had told the truth. The pain was nerve induction, a simulation, leaving no physical damage. You may be the one, she said, and the words came out almost to herself. A human. Most men tested by the Gom Jabbar die. Paul flexed his fingers. The ghost of the pain still lived in his hand, a memory stored in the synapses. He would feel it again, years later, when he held his hand in a desert Stilton and thought of home. The terrible purpose. The Reverend Mother allowed Jessica to return to the room. Paul saw the look that passed between them, a teacher's cold assessment, a student's wary relief, and understood something he had been too young to notice before. His mother had been trained by this woman. She trained and tested and shaped, just as she was now shaping him. Someday, lad, the old woman said, you too may have to face such a test, and you will have to know what you are doing. But not yet. You are young. What is the test? Paul asked. What did you prove? That you are human. She paused, and her eyes seemed to look at something beyond the walls of the room. The Bene Gesserit have worked for many generations to produce a certain man, the Kwisatz Haderach, the shortening of the way, a male who can look where we cannot look, into that place where the truth-sayer cannot go. A man who can see the future, not see, be. The Kwisatz Haderach can be many places at once in his mind. He can look into the masculine and feminine past. Many have tried to become this thing. All have died. Paul felt something shift inside him. A door that had been closed now cracked open, letting in a cold wind. They died from the drug you used? The spice essence, the water of life? Every male who has attempted the transformation has died. She looked at him with an expression he could not read. We thought you might be the one. Might be. The words hung in the air. Paul thought of the test, the pain in the box, the needle at his throat. All of that, and still only, might be. He felt something stir in his chest, not hope, but the shadow of a terrible weight, a purpose that had not yet revealed its shape. You speak of breeding us, Paul said slowly, like cattle. We have been doing it for 90 generations. Paul felt the cold wind become a gale. That offends me. There is something against rightness in it. The old woman smiled, and the smile had no kindness in it. You begin to sense the terrible purpose then. Good. You will need it. She departed Castle Caladan that night, and as she left, Paul saw her wipe at her eyes. The Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Moyam, Imperial Truthsayer, was weeping. He did not know why, and she did not explain. The Baron's Globe. On the industrial hellscape of Gedi Prime, in a palace built from the labor of slaves, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen sat suspended in his suspensor chair and contemplated a globe of Arrakis, Marco d'Estaing. And the globe was an expensive toy, carved from a single piece of bloodstone, its surface showing the great deserts and the polar sink regions in exquisite detail. He spun it idly with one thick finger. Beside him stood Peter de Vries, the twisted mentat, his spice-stained lips curled in a permanent sneer. And nearby, watching with the hungry attention of a predator still learning to hunt, stood the Baron's nephew, Feyd-Rautha. Duke Leto is walking into a trap, Peter said, and the pleasure in his voice was obscene. He thinks he can tame Arrakis. He thinks he can befriend the Fremen. He does not know that the Emperor himself has signed his death warrant. The Baron stopped spinning the globe. You enjoy yourself too much, Peter. There is a thing about delighting in pain that weakens the mind. Peter's face tightened. He was addicted to spice, eating it like candy, and the habit had left him with a tremor in his hands and a volatility in his moods that even the Baron found tiresome. I merely observe the completeness of the scheme, my Baron. The scheme is incomplete until the Duke and his entire line are dead. The Baron turned the globe again, watching the light play across the red stone. The great houses must see the consequences of defying us. A public end. No heirs, no legacy, no hope. Feyd-Rautha stepped closer to the globe. Uncle, how will we reach them? The Duke has his own soldiers, his own mentat for Hawat, Peter interrupted. A fine mentat. I once served with him before the Baron acquired my contract. He will be blinded by his own loyalty. And the Lady Jessica, the Baron added, his voice dropping, the Bene Gesserit witch. She thinks she has hidden her son from us, but we know what he is. Peter made a mistake once about her child. He thought she would bear a daughter, as the Bene Gesserit commanded. But she bore a son, a wild card. Peter flinched at the reminder of his error, and the Baron noted it with satisfaction. A mentat who doubted his own predictions was a mentat who could be controlled. The plan, the Baron continued, is simple. We will lure the Duke to Arrakis. We will use a man inside his household, a souk doctor whose conditioning we have broken to disable the house shields and deliver the Duke to us. Sardaukar troopers, disguised in our livery, will do the killing. The Emperor's own terror troops, wearing Harkonnen colors, erasing the Atreides line while we keep our hands clean. Then the boy? Feyd-Rautha asked. There will be an accident, Peter said, at the residency. A hunter-seeker, perhaps, something that cannot be traced. The Baron nodded. And when the Duke is dead, when his son is dead, when his woman is dead, we will take back what is ours. Arrakis, the spice, the power. He reached down and stopped the globe spinning with a single finger, pressing it against the equator of the bloodstone world. Send word to the Duke, the Baron said. Invite him to a meeting. He will refuse, he always does, and by refusing, he will invoke Canley. Formal vendetta. He will declare himself our enemy in front of the entire Imperium, and when we destroy him, no one will lift a hand to help. Peter grinned. The Duke is a man of honor. Honor is a rope. It can be used to bind or to hang. The Baron did not smile. He was already thinking ahead, to the spice that would flow into his coffers, to the power that would accumulate like sand in an hourglass. Atreides were already dead. They just did not know it yet. The Mother's Disobedience. On Caladan, after the Reverend Mother had wept and departed, Jessica sat alone with the weight of her choices. The old woman had summoned her before leaving, not to comfort, but to condemn. You were told to bear only daughters, the Reverend Mother said. The breeding plan required a daughter, an Atreides daughter, to be wed to a Harkonnen heir, to bring the bloodlines together in the next generation. Instead, you gave the Duke a son. I gave him what he wanted, Jessica said. He wanted a son. You loved him. That was your weakness. You let love override the plan. Jessica did not deny it. She had served the Bene Gesserit for 20 years, trained by this very woman, shaped into a weapon of observation and control, and in the end, she had chosen the man she loved over the order she served. Your son may be the Kwisatz Haderach, the Reverend Mother said, or he may be a dead end, a generation too soon, a flawed vessel, a man who can see the future but cannot survive it. We do not know. What we do know is that you have put him in danger, put all of us in danger by your disobedience. What would you have me do? Train him. The voice, the Pranabindu disciplines, the litany against fear. Forget the regular order of instruction. He must be ready. For what? The old woman's eyes went distant. Arrakis. The desert. There are things there that we prepared for long ago. The Missionaria Protectiva has planted legends among the Fremen legends of a mother and son who would come to lead them. If your Paul survives what is coming, those legends may save him. And if he does not survive, then a sisterhood will have lost 90 generations of work, and the Harkonnens will rule Arrakis, and the spice will flow into the coffers of a monster. The Reverend Mother stood, and for a moment her ancient face cracked open with something that might have been grief. I loved you, Jessica. You were my best pupil. I hope, for all our sakes, that your son is worth the price you have paid." She left, and Jessica sat alone, and the rain of Caladan beat against the windows of Castle Atreides for what might be the last time. Paul's dream and the Fremen secret. In the days before departure, Paul found himself walking the halls of the castle with a new awareness. Every stone, every tapestry, every servant's face seemed to hold a question. Will I see this again? He found Thufir Hawat in the training hall, the old Mentat assassin going over logistics reports with the grim efficiency of a man who knew the odds were not in their favor. Hawat looked up as Paul entered and immediately scowled. "You're sitting with your back to the door." Paul shifted his position. "Old habit. It'll get you killed on Arrakis." Hawat's scarred face was unreadable, but his voice carried something Paul rarely heard from him: worry. "The storms there, lad. 700 kilometers an hour. They can strip the flesh from a man's bones. And that's just the weather. The Harkonnens spent 80 years there, and they left traps in every shadow. Booby-trapped equipment, sabotage spice harvesters, death commands waiting in the tribal memory of the people. The Reverend Mother said my father will lose Arrakis." Hawat went still. "She said that? She said the Duke will fall. She said I will be alone." The old Mentat's face was unreadable for a long moment. Then he did something unusual. He sat down heavily, as if the weight of his years had suddenly caught up with him. "There is something you should know, young master. Something I have not told anyone except your father." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The Fremen, the desert people, the Imperium thinks they are scattered tribes of scavengers, a few 100,000 at most. That is wrong. How many? Many, many more than anyone suspects. They hate the Harkonnens with a bloody passion. Your father is already negotiating with them through Duncan, Idaho. If we can gain their loyalty—" He trailed off. "Then we have an army," Paul finished. "A desert army. Men who know the sand, who can survive where no off-worlder can survive. The Reverend Mother says your father will lose Arrakis. And but a duke who commands the loyalty of the Fremen, that duke might keep something the old woman never predicted." It was the first hope Paul had felt since the box he held onto it. The lesson of blades. On the morning of departure, Paul heard Thufir Hawat's footsteps in the corridor and called out to him, "Don't sit with your back to any doors." Hawat paused, and for the first time in Paul's memory, the old Mentat smiled. Then he was gone, into the ship that would take him ahead to Arrakis, and Paul was alone in the hallway with the knowledge that Caladan was already receding from him. He went to the training hall and found Gurney Halleck waiting. The ugly lump of a man, the troubadour soldier who had taught Paul knife work since he could hold a blade, was standing in the center of the room with a kinjal in one hand and a bodkin in the other. "We fight for real today," Gurney said. "No shields, no mood." Paul drew his own blades. They circled each other, and the room fell away. The bout was fast and brutal, Gurney pressing, Paul countering, the dance of edge and point and the near-invisible shifts of weight that meant survival or death. When it ended, Gurney's kinjal was at Paul's groin, and Paul's bodkin was at Gurney's throat. "Draw," Gurney said, and stepped back. He was not smiling. "You see? You fought because I made you fight. Mood had nothing to do with it. On Arrakis, you will not have the luxury of feeling ready. You will fight when you are tired, when you are grieving, when you are afraid. And if you hesitate, you die. Do you understand?" Paul nodded. He understood more than Gurney knew. Before they left for the landing field, Dr. Wellington Yu, the Suk school physician, stopped Paul in the corridor. Yu's face was drawn with something Paul could not name, and his hands shook slightly as he pressed a small book into Paul's palms. "The Orange Catholic Bible," Yu said. "A miniature edition. I thought you might find comfort in it." Paul opened the book. A passage was marked, the page worn from repeated reading. He recognized the verse as one of the surgeon's favorites. His wife had loved it, Yue once said, before the Harkonnens took her. "What I do," Yue said, half to himself, "is done to be certain my Wana no longer can be hurt by the Harkonnen beasts." Paul looked at the doctor's face and saw something there that he filed away, uncomprehending, into the place where his instincts lived. The trap revealed. On the flight to Arrakis, Duke Leto Atreides sat with his son and told him the truth. "The Harkonnens have been stockpiling spice for 20 years, the Duke said. "They have enough to crash the market, to manipulate the guild, to destabilize the entire Imperium. And the Emperor is complicit. He fears me, fears what the Atreides name means, fears the loyalty I command among the great houses. So he is giving us Arrakis, a poisoned gift. Paul absorbed this. A trap, the finest trap ever baited. Arrakis is the single most valuable planet in the universe. Whoever controls the spice controls the Imperium. And the Emperor is handing it to us, knowing the Harkonnens will do anything to take it back. We walk in knowing we will be attacked. We walk in knowing the shape of the trap. That's the first step in evading it. The Duke leaned forward, and his voice dropped. There is something else. The Fremen. Do you remember what I told you about Salusa Secundus, the Emperor's prison planet, where the Sardaukar are trained? The harshness of that world makes the Sardaukar what they are. But Arrakis is harsher. The Fremen have been shaped by a world that makes Salusa Secundus look like a garden. If we can win their loyalty, we have the potential of a core as strong and deadly as the Sardaukar, perhaps stronger. Duncan Idaho is already with them, Paul said. It was not a question. Duncan is with them. He is our ambassador, our bridge to the desert. If he succeeds, we will have an army that no one, not the Harkonnens, not the Emperor expects. The Duke paused, and something shifted in his face. There is one more thing. You have Mentat potential. Fufer has seen it, I have seen it. The training has already begun, whether you knew it or not. Paul thought of the calculations he had been doing unconsciously, the patterns he had been seeing in the behavior of the people around him. "It'll go on with the training," he said. His father nodded, and in that nod was something Paul had never seen before, the acknowledgement of an equal. Arrival in Arrakeen. Arrakeen was nothing like Caladan. The city crouched in the shadow of the shield wall, a vast rock formation that protected the northern settlements from the worst of the desert storms. The air was dry beyond anything Jessica had experienced. She felt the moisture being pulled from her skin with every breath. The people who gathered at the landing field were lean and weathered, their eyes a uniform blue within blue, stained by the spice that saturated everything on Arrakis. The residency was a fortress built by Harkonnens, all thick walls and hidden passages and the lingering smell of old violence. Jessica walked through its corridors and felt a dread that had nothing to do with the Bene Gesserit warnings. This place was wrong. It had been built by enemies, inhabited by enemies, and somewhere in its stones the memory of those enemies remained. Duke Leto was already at work. She found him in their private quarters, supervising the unpacking of the bull's head that had belonged to his father. The old duke had died fighting a bull, and Leto kept the head as a symbol of mortality, of the Atreides line of the violence that was never far from any noble house. "It goes in the dining hall," Leto said. "My husband, the dining hall it goes in the dining hall. I want our enemies to see it. I want our friends to remember whose blood runs in these halls." Jessica said nothing. She had learned, over the years, when to argue and when to let the Duke have his way. This was one of the latter moments. He was afraid she could see it in the set of his shoulders. The tightness around his eyes and fear made him stubborn. "There is a Fremen woman who wishes to serve you," Leto said, changing the subject. "A housekeeper. She calls herself the Shadout Mapes. The Shadout, that is a Fremen title. It means well-dipper, a position of some honor. Then she will serve you well." He paused. "The Fremen have legends, Jessica, legends planted by your order, long ago. They speak of a Bene Gesserit woman who will come to Arrakis and bring change. A mother and a son, the Missionaria Protectiva." The Bene Gesserit had seeded religious myths across the galaxy, preparing the way for their sisters in times of need. Now those myths were sprouting in the desert, and Jessica was being drawn into them whether she wanted it or not. The Kreis knife. Shadout Mapes was a woman carved from Arrakis itself, wrinkled, hard, with the blue eyes that marked a lifetime of spice exposure. She appeared in Jessica's chambers without sound, a bundle of brown cloth and a face that revealed nothing. "I am the Shadout Mapes," she said. "I wish to serve the Lady Jessica." Jessica studied her. The woman's stance was tense, expectant. She was waiting for something. "You have something for me?" Jessica said. From the folds of her dress, Mapes produced a blade. It was perhaps 20 centimeters long, milky white, with a rough handle of bone. The edge caught the light and seemed to glow from within. "Do you know what this is?" Mapes asked. Jessica felt the weight of the moment. The Fremen had a test for her, a ritual she did not understand but had to pass. She reached into her training, into the legends the missionaria protectiva had planted, and found the word she needed. "It is a maker," she said. Mapes inhaled sharply. "You know the word, the sacred word. Then you are the one." The blade was a Kreis knife, carved from the tooth of a sandworm. Unfixed. If it spent more than a week away from human flesh, it would disintegrate, a sacred object of the Fremen, not to be seen by outsiders. Anyone who saw it without being of the tribe could be killed. Mapes extended the knife. "Take it. It is yours." Jessica took the blade, and in that moment she became something she had not intended to become, the fulfillment of a prophecy, the center of a legend, the woman who would lead the Fremen to freedom. She felt the weight of the Kreis knife in her hand and the weight of the future pressing down on her, and she did not know how to carry either one. The hunter, seeker. Paul lay on his bed, feigning sleep, waiting for the room to grow still. He had learned to sense when someone was watching him, and something in the air that afternoon felt wrong, a tiny hum, a vibration at the edge of hearing. He opened his eyes a slit. A hunter-seeker. The thing was no larger than his thumb, a sliver of metal and circuitry that floated on suspensor fields, guided remotely by an operator somewhere nearby. It moved with the terrible patience of a thing that had all the time in the world. Its nose eye rotated, searching, and Paul understood with cold clarity that it was looking for movement. Looking for him. He forced himself to absolute stillness. The hunter-seeker drifted closer. He could see the tiny needle at its tip, the poison reservoir that would deliver death with a single prick. It passed over his face. Paul exploded into motion. His hand shot out, grabbed the hunter-seeker, and smashed its nose-eye against the metal doorplate. The device sparked and died, and he threw it to the floor, breathing hard. Shadout Mapes arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion. She stared at the dead hunter-seeker, then at Paul. "There is a traitor among you," she said flatly. "That thing was controlled from inside the house. Someone here wants you dead." Paul's hand still remembered the shape of the device, the vibration of it struggling against his grip. Someone in this house. He thought of his mother, his father, both somewhere in these corridors, neither knowing what had just come through his door. "Find who guided it," he said. Mapes nodded, and in her blue eyes there was something that might have been respect. "We Fremen pay our debts, be they black debts or white debts. I will find the one who did this." She left, and Paul was alone with the dead hunter-seeker and the knowledge that the war had already begun. The conservatory and the warning. Jessica discovered the hidden room by accident. She had been searching for Paul, tracing the labyrinthine corridors of the residency, when her hand touched a catch in the wall. A door swung open, and she stepped into a place that should not exist on Arrakis. A conservatory, lush with off-world plants. A fountain trickling water into a stone basin in the center of the room. Water. On Arrakis, water was worth more than spice, and here it was being wasted on a hidden garden. She moved through the room, touching the leaves of plants that had no business on a desert planet. Her fingers brushed something, a note, pinned to a frond, written in the coded language of the Bene Gesserit. "Your son and the Duke are in immediate danger. A trusted companion will betray the Duke. The Harkonnens plan to give you as a gift to a minion. Trust no one." The note was signed with a name she recognized. Margot Lady Fenring, a fellow Bene Gesserit, stationed somewhere in the Imperium, woman to Count Casimir Fenring. She had been in this house. She had left this warning, and she had left it in code that only another sister would recognize. Jessica's mind raced through the possibilities. A trusted companion. A betrayal in the inner circle. The Harkonnen plan was not just a military assault, it was a rot that had already taken root inside House Atreides itself. She found Paul in the corridor, his face flushed with the aftermath of the hunter-seeker attack. "A hunter-seeker came through my door," he said, "controlled from inside the house. Mapes says there is a traitor among us." Jessica held out the note. "A trusted companion will betray your father. The Harkonnens plan to give me to one of their minions. Lady Fenring left this another Bene Gesserit. She was in this house before we arrived." Paul took the note, read it, and his face went still. "Someone we trust," he said. "Someone we trust," Jessica repeated. The word sat in the corridor between them like a live thing. Paul led her to a window and pointed toward the shield wall. A tiny light was blinking there, a signal, flashing in code, visible across the basin. Someone is watching us, Paul said. Someone in the desert, and they're talking to someone who can see that signal from inside this house. The trap was larger than they had imagined, and it had already closed around them. The Duke's wrath. Duke Leto stood in the Arrakeen Tower and repeated the same 3 sentences over and over in his mind. They have tried to take the life of my son. They have tried to take the life of my son. They have tried to take the life of my son. The rage was a cold thing, not hot. It settled into his bones and made a home there. He looked out at the desert night, at the false stars of signal lights winking across the basin, and he understood that he had brought his family into a death trap. But he was not dead yet, and neither were they. Gurney Halleck arrived, his ugly face grim with the news of the assassination attempt. My lord, the house is being searched. We've found the operator, a Harkonnen agent planted months ago. He's dead now, but there may be others. There are always others, Leto said. The Harkonnens have had 80 years to seed this planet with their poison. We will be pulling out thorns for a generation. He turned from the window. I want you to let Thufir have whatever men he needs. We are going to hire every experienced spice hunter on this planet. We are going to recruit every Fremen who will carry a knife for us, and we are going to build an army that will make the Harkonnens regret they ever heard the name Atreides. Gurney nodded. And the smugglers? Tax them. Bring them into the fold. Whoever can survive the open desert without guild assistance knows something we need to learn. The Duke looked once more at the desert, at the false stars winking in the cliff. They have tried to take the life of my son. The next time the Harkonnens moved against him, he would be ready, or he would die making them pay. The Reverend Mother's words echoed in his memory. Your father will lose Arrakis. Perhaps, but the Duke intended to take as many of his enemies with him as he could. Episode 2, Duke Leto reaffirms Hawat and learns of Fremen's strength under Liet to Yue's betrayal, and morning light cut through the tower windows of the Arrakeen residency, and Duke Leto Atreides was already working. He stood at the head of the conference table, a map of the northern settlements spread before him, and issued orders to Gurney Halleck with the clipped precision of a man who had not slept. Hire anyone with open sand experience, spice drivers, weather scanners, dune men. Hold it to 20% of the workforce where you can, but I want every qualified hand on this planet working for House Atreides within the month. Gurney nodded, his inkvine scar pulling tight across his jaw. And the men for Hawat? 300 of the best. The Duke glanced at the doorway. Where is Thufir? He should have been here by now. The question hung in the air, and Gurney did not answer. He simply gathered his orders and left, and the Duke turned back to his maps with a frown. When Thufir Hawat finally entered the room, he did not stride in as the master of assassins of a great house. He shuffled. His shoulders were bent, his face gray beneath its weathered lines, and in his hands he carried a document that he placed on the Duke's table as though it were a death warrant. My Lord Duke, Hawat said, and his voice cracked on the title. I am submitting my resignation. Leto stared at him. What are you talking about? The boy, your son. A hunter-seeker got within a meter of him inside this very house in his own chambers, and Hawat stopped, and the old soldier's eyes glistened. I am the one charged with the security of this household. I failed. Paul could be dead because I failed. I am offering you my resignation in the hope that you will accept it and appoint someone more competent. Leto did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was quiet and hard. You have been in my service for 3 generations of Atreides. You knew my father. You taught me to walk, to ride, to handle a blade. You trained my son to think like a mentat before he was old enough to shave, and now you come to me with this? My Lord Thufir, sit down. Hawat did not sit. I have already begun the process of selecting a replacement. There is a man among the new recruits, a former Harkonnen security officer who I said, sit down. The old man's knees seemed to buckle. He lowered himself into the chair across from the Duke, and he looked like a man who had already carried his own coffin to the grave. Leto leaned forward. You are not responsible for the hunter-seeker. That device was planted long before we arrived on Arrakis. The Harkonnens spent 80 years layering this house with their venom. No security force in the Imperium could have found every trap in 3 days. You know this, my lord. The boy is alive. He is alive because he kept his head and moved faster than the machine. You trained him for that. You trained him to think, to observe, to trust his instincts. If anyone deserves credit for Paul's survival, it is you. Hawat shook his head. The responsibility is mine. I brought my family to Arrakis knowing it was a trap. I walked into the Harkonnens' jaws because the Emperor gave me no choice. If blame is to be assigned, let it fall on the man who made the decision, not on the man who has spent his life keeping this house safe. The Duke stood and walked around the table. He placed a hand on Hawat's shoulder, a breach of protocol, a gesture of intimacy that the old man had not received from a superior in decades. I need you, Thufir. I need your mind, your instincts, your knowledge of this place and its dangers. You are the finest warrior mentat in the Imperium, and I am walking into a war that I cannot win without you. So I am refusing your resignation, not as a kindness, as a necessity. Hawat looked up at him, and something in the old man's face shifted. The shame was still there, buried deep, but above it now was something else. The fierce, unbreakable loyalty that had driven him through 3 generations of Atreides lords. I will remain with you, my lord, Hawat said, until the end. There will be no end, the Duke said. Not for us, not while we still draw breath. He returned to his seat and gestured at the maps. Now, tell me about the Fremen. The Leet problem. What Hawat reported changed the strategic calculus of everything the Duke had planned. The Fremen were not scattered desert tribes scraping a subsistence living from the rocks. They were organized, they were disciplined, and they were far, far more numerous than anyone in the Imperium believed. Duncan Idaho was received at one of their sieges, Hawat said, spreading his notes across the table. A fortified cave complex in the shield wall. He estimates the population of that single siege at 10,000. 10,000 men, women, and children in one settlement. The Duke absorbed this. 10,000 in one siege. How many sieges are there? Unknown, my lord, but Idaho reports evidence of a network, trade routes, supply caches. The Fremen operate as a coherent society across much of the desert, and they all answer to a single leader. Who? A man named Lyot. Hawat frowned at his notes. Or possibly a deity. The distinction is unclear. The Fremen speak of Lyot with a reverence that borders on religious awe. Idaho could not determine whether Lyot is a living leader or a figure of legend. A living leader, Paul said from the doorway. Both men turned. Paul had entered without sound, a habit he was developing that Leto found both impressive and slightly unsettling. The boy moved like his mother, all grace and silence. How do you know? The Duke asked. I've been listening to the house servants. The Fremen ones, the ones who speak to Mapes. They talk about Liet as someone who gives orders, current orders. Things like Liet says we are to watch the off-worlders, and Liet says the water is to be shared. Whatever Liet is, he or she is alive and active. Hawat nodded slowly. The boy has good instincts. The boy has mentat training, Paul said, and there was an edge in his voice that Leto recognized. His son was growing up fast. Too fast, maybe, and the process was sharpening him in ways that could cut. Sit down, Paul, the Duke said. If you're going to eavesdrop on war councils, you might as well contribute. Paul took a seat at the table. What else did Duncan report? That the Fremen are willing to consider an alliance, Hawat said. They hate the Harkonnens with a passion that goes beyond politics. The Harkonnens hunted them for sport, enslaved their children, burned their sieges when they refused to cooperate. The Fremen have been waiting for anyone who would stand against House Harkonnen. They are open to the possibility that House Atreides might be that someone. Open to the possibility, the Duke repeated. Not committed. They are a cautious people, my lord. The desert teaches patience. They will not rush into an alliance without proof that we are different from our predecessors. Then we will give them proof. Leto stood and walked to the window. The morning sun was climbing over the shield wall, painting the desert in shades of gold and rust. What about the spice operations? What did the Harkonnens leave us? Hawat's face hardened. A wasteland, my lord, in every sense. The Harkonnen plunder. The numbers were worse than anyone had anticipated. Hawat laid it out in the War Council that afternoon, with Halleck, Paul, and the senior officers gathered around the table. Baron Harkonnen's operation had extracted 10 billion Solaris from Arrakis every 330 standard days, an obscene profit margin that had funded their political machinations across the Imperium for generations. And when they left, the Harkonnens had not simply abandoned their equipment, they had sabotaged it. Fewer than half the sandcrawlers are operational, Hawat reported. The carryalls are in even worse condition. Of the spice harvesters, perhaps 1 in 3 can be made to function. The ornithopter fleet has been stripped of essential components. We are looking at months of repair work before we can approach even a fraction of the previous output. And the spice reserves? The Duke asked. Depleted. The Harkonnens liquidated everything before the transfer. There is no spice in the Arrakeen silos, no reserve for the guild payments, no stockpile for emergencies. We are starting from nothing. Gurney Halleck let out a low whistle. They meant to strangle us before we drew our first breath. They meant to make us fail, the Duke said. To make us look incompetent, to bleed our treasury dry, and to force us to beg the Emperor for relief. And when we went to the Emperor on our knees, the Harkonnens would be there to finish the job. Then we don't beg, Paul said. All eyes turned to him. We don't play their game. We find another source of income. The smugglers. Hawat raised an eyebrow. The smugglers are outside the law, my young master, Lax. The guild tolerates them because they provide a secondary spice flow that keeps prices stable. But they are not exactly the sort of people a great house should be seen doing business with. We don't do business with them, Paul said. We tax them. The Duke smiled a thin, predatory expression that Paul had seen only a few times before. Go on. The smugglers operate on Arrakis without license. They use our desert, our spice sands, our airspace. Under imperial law, the planetary governor has the right to levy fees on any commercial activity within his fief. We offer them a deal, pay a tithe to House Atreides, and we will not interfere with their operations. Refuse, and we will hunt them down as pirates. That will start a war, Gurney said. The Harkonnens are already starting a war, Paul replied. At least this way we'll be able to pay for it. Leto studied his son for a long moment. The boy was thinking like a duke, like a mentat duke, weighing variables and calculating outcomes. It was what Leto had hoped for. It was also, in some way he could not quite name, terrifying. Hawat, the Duke said, I want a full intelligence report on the smuggler operations by tomorrow. Gurney, you will head a delegation to make contact with their leadership. Offer them terms. If they accept, we will bank the tithe in a separate account, a war chest, hidden from the Harkonnens and the Emperor alike. If they refuse, well, cross that sand when we reach it, Gurney said. The Duke nodded. Now, what about the Fremen and their shields? Paul leaned forward. This was the question that had been nagging at him since the briefing began. Hawat, he said, you mentioned that shields attract sandworms. Is that confirmed? Absolutely confirmed, young master. A shield generator running at full power will drive any worm within 100 kilometers into a killing frenzy. The Harkonnens lost dozens of harvesters that way before they learned to shut down shields during spice operations. So the Fremen don't use shields at all. Hawat shook his head. According to Idaho, the Fremen are amused by shields. They consider them a crutch, a weakness that off-worlders rely on instead of learning to survive in the desert. They fight without shields. They travel without shields. And somehow, they manage to live in the deep desert despite the worms. How? That, Hawat said, is a mystery Idaho has not yet solved. The Fremen are not sharing their secrets. Not yet. But if we can win their trust, we can learn how to move through the desert without attracting worms, Paul finished. Which means we can operate in places the Harkonnens cannot reach. We can make the desert itself our fortress. The Duke looked at his son with something approaching pride. You're starting to understand. The desert is not just a death trap, Paul said. It's a weapon, and the Fremen know how to use it. The price of loyalty. The staff meeting ran for another 3 hours. Equipment inventories were reviewed. Personnel assignments were confirmed. The thorny question of water discipline, the single most critical factor in desert survival, was hammered into every officer present until they could recite the rules in their sleep. And through it all, one fact remained unspoken, but understood by everyone in the room. House Atreides was bleeding money, surrounded by enemies, and dependent on the goodwill of a desert people whose secrets they did not yet know. When the meeting finally broke, Hawat lingered. The old mentat waited until the room cleared, then approached the Duke with a document he had been holding back throughout the session. My lord, there is something else, something I did not wish to discuss in front of the full council. The Duke's expression did not change. Tell me. Hawat laid the document on the table. It was a strip of Shiga wire film, the kind used for covert message recording. This was discovered among the possessions of a Harkonnen courier who was captured 3 days before our arrival. The message is fragmentary, but the meaning is clear. Leto picked up the film. The words were stenciled in Harkonnen battle code. Ito will never suspect, and when the blow falls on him from a beloved hand, its source alone should be enough to destroy him. A beloved hand, the Duke repeated, meaning someone in your inner circle, my lord, someone close to you, someone you trust absolutely. The silence in the room was absolute. Who else knows about this? Leto asked. No one. I decoded the message myself. I have not shared it with Halleck or Idaho or any of the junior officers. Not even Paul? No, my lord. The Duke set the film down and walked to the window. The sun was high now, bleaching the desert to white. Somewhere out there, beyond the shield wall, the Fremen were waiting. The smugglers were waiting. The Harkonnens were waiting. And somewhere inside his own household, a traitor was waiting too. Who do you suspect? The Duke asked. The old man's hands trembled on the table. My lord, I must speak plainly. The message indicates a blow from a beloved hand. There is only one person in your household who fits that description and who also has the access and capability to orchestrate a betrayal of this magnitude. Say her name. Lady Jessica. The Duke did not turn around. His voice was flat, controlled. On what evidence? Circumstantial, my lord, but the Bene Gesserit are known to place their own interests above those of any great house. Lady Jessica was sent to you by the sisterhood. She bore you a son instead of the daughter she was ordered to produce. She has trained Paul in ways that exceed your authority. And Hawat stopped. And the message. A blow from a beloved hand. Who else could it be? Duke Leto turned from the window, and Hawat was shocked by what he saw in his lord's face. Not shock, not denial, but a cold, weary understanding. Thank you, Thufir. I will consider your report. My lord, I must recommend I will consider your report, the Duke repeated. In the meantime, I want Lady Jessica placed under discreet surveillance. Use only men who have no connection to the Bene Gesserit. I want to know everyone she speaks to, everywhere she goes, every message she sends. Is that understood? Perfectly, my lord. Dismissed. Hawat left, and the Duke was alone with the message and the desert and the terrible weight of what he had just ordered. He did not believe Jessica was a traitor. Not for a moment. The Harkonnens were masters of manipulation, and this message was precisely the kind of poison they would plant to sow discord among their enemies. Hawat was a mentat, trained to process data without emotion, but even a mentat could be led to false conclusions if the data was cleverly faked. But the suspicion was now in the air. And sometimes the Duke knew the best way to catch a traitor was to let the traitor believe their plan was working. He would play along. He would order the surveillance. He would distance himself from Jessica in ways that would be noticed. And when the real traitor showed their hand, he would be ready. It was a cold strategy. It would hurt Jessica. It would hurt Paul. But war was cold, and the Harkonnens had already proved they would stop at nothing. As the Duke stood alone in the council chamber, he touched the hawk emblem on his uniform and whispered the words that had become his mantra since arriving on Arrakis. I must rule with eye and claw, as the hawk among lesser birds. The dinner. The formal dinner at the Arrakeen residency was a political battlefield dressed in silk and candlelight. Every local dignitary of consequence had been invited. The water shippers who controlled the planet's most precious resource, the spice merchants who brokered the deals that kept the Imperium running, the guild bank representatives who held the financial strings that connected Arrakis to the galactic economy. Duke Leto needed them all as allies, or at least as neutrals in the coming struggle, and they in turn were watching him with the cold, appraising eyes of people who had survived decades of Harkonnen rule and knew that the new Duke's reign might be measured in months rather than years. The dinner began with a ritual that Leto had not anticipated. Servants moved among the guests with ewers of water and small basins, and the guests, following a custom so old it had become instinct, dipped their fingers in the basins and wiped them on towels that the servants then wrung out over the ewers. The water was recycled. The gesture was one of shared comradeship in a desert world. But what Leto saw was something else entirely. The water from those towels, he murmured to Jessica, who sat beside him at the head table. It goes back into the ewers. The guests are washing their hands in each other's filth. It is a Harkonnen custom, Jessica said, a demonstration of the Baron's contempt for his subjects. By forcing them to share dirty water, he reminded them of their subservience. The Duke stood up. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to him. Moan this night forward, Leto said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. The ritual of the laving basins is abolished. He gestured to the servants. Take the ewers outside. Give the water to the beggars at the gate. Every beggar is to receive a full cup of clean water, drawn fresh, in the name of House Atreides. The silence stretched into shock. A water shipper named Lingar Bucht, a fat man, with the florid complexion of someone who had never gone thirsty, rose to his feet. My Lord Duke, this custom has been observed for 8 decades. It was instituted by the Baron Harkonnen himself as a symbol of his contempt for the people of Arrakis, Leto interrupted. I am not the Baron. House Atreides does not demonstrate its power by humiliating its guests. It demonstrates its power by protecting its people. The custom is abolished. Boot sat down, his face reddening further. The other guests exchanged glances, and Leto could read the calculations behind their eyes. This one is different, they were thinking. This one might be dangerous. The meal continued, and the political maneuvering continued with it. Jessica, seated among a cluster of merchant wives, found herself next to the strange figure of Dr. Kynes, the imperial planetologist, a man who seemed to exist in a space between worlds. His eyes were the blue within blue of a spice addict, but his bearing was that of a man who held secrets he would die before revealing. You are the Duke's lady, Kynes said. But you are also Bene Gesserit. I am. Then you know of the Missionaria Protectiva, the planting of religious legends in primitive cultures. Jessica stiffened. I know of it. Kynes leaned closer. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. There is a legend among the Fremen, a legend of a mother and a son who will come from off-world and change the face of Arrakis. They call the son the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world. They call the mother the Reverend Mother. They believe that when these figures arrive, the desert will bloom and the Fremen will be free. Jessica felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooled air of the dining hall. Why are you telling me this? Because the Fremen believe your son is the Lisan al-Gaib. They have been watching him. They have seen things in his face, in his manner, that match the prophecies your sisterhood planted here centuries ago. And I am telling you this, Lady Jessica, because legends are dangerous things, especially when people start to believe them. Before Jessica could respond, Kynes shifted the conversation with the practiced ease of a man who knew how to deflect. There is a term the Fremen use, he said. A very old term. They speak of the shortening of the way. The words hit Jessica like a physical blow. The shortening of the way. The Kwisatz Haderach. The Bene Gesserit's ultimate goal. The male who could look where no woman had ever looked and survive. The hope of the sisterhood for millennia. The Fremen use this term? Jessica asked, keeping her voice steady. They do. What does it mean, Lady Jessica? It means... She stopped. It means that my sisterhood has been here longer than I knew. Across the hall, the Duke rose to deliver a toast. He raised his water flagon and, before a room of horrified locals who had been raised to worship every drop of moisture, deliberately spilled its contents onto the floor. To the future of Arrakis, the Duke said, a future in which water is abundant and all people drink freely. Let the desert see that House Atreides keeps its promises. The guests had no choice but to follow suit. One by one, they emptied their flagons onto the floor, and the water pooled on the stone tiles in a display of wealth so extravagant, so audacious, that it would be talked about in every sietch, every merchant house, and every smuggler camp on the planet by morning.